Hey everyone! For today's video, I'm trying something a little different and using Altenew's Parisian motif stamp set in two different ways, using two different techniques to do a bit of mass production. The layout for the card is almost the same, but the two sets end up looking very different. So for the first card set, I'm using VersaFine ink on watercolor paper so I can heat emboss using clear embossing powder. Since the watercolor paper is textured, I'm using the Misty Stamp Positioner to make sure I get a good impression of the stamp. Once I finish heat embossing everything, the card panel is ready to go. I'm going to go ahead and use the Molotow masking pen to cover up the two main flowers, and this takes a bit of time since the image is rather large, but I want to mask it off so that when I use distressings for the background, the flowers will remain uncolored. And it's a thin layer of the masking fluid, and you'll see later on that I rushed some parts a bit so the watercolor will seep through, but we can work around it. It's not a big deal. On the Ken Oliver craft mat, I'm smooshing distressings directly onto the mat. And for the first card, I'm using Chipped Sapphire and Salty Ocean. And I'll use a mister that I found around the house, and I'll mist the craft mat directly. The wire changes the distressings to watercolors and help blend the two colors together. And I'll take the cardstock and directly put it onto the ink where the flowers are. Since I wanted to add more color to this, I'll also take a water brush and flicker additional color onto it. It's a really easy technique without any rhyme or reason, and you can use two different colors or just one or multiple colors. I just used two so that there was some contrast. Once the entire panel was dry, I'll use a Xyron adhesive eraser to remove the Molotow masking. It takes a bit of time since I covered a lot of the surface, but I really enjoyed uncovering it and seeing that it was white. And some of the watercolor actually seeped through, but that's easy to work around. I'm making thank you cards with these card panels using the sentiment from Hero Art's March 2018 kit, and it looks perfect for this card. And I originally was going to plan on leaving the flowers white, but I actually decided that it would look better if it looked a little bit monotone. So I took a Real Color Zig brush marker in mid gray and just added it to the flowers. And while I was doing this, I thought that if I did the entire flower with just gray, it would look a little bit too monotone. So I added green for the leaves and the stem. And I think that adds a little pop of color since most of the colors I used for the distressings weren't in the green color family. Just adding the gray to the flowers lets you focus solely on the distress inks smushing happening in the background. And for all the flower coloring, it's really easy. I'm using those Zig markers to lay down colors at points where I want it to look the darkest. And I'll use a watercolor brush to pull out the color. And it does make for really easy coloring. Once I'm done coloring, I'll add the sentiment using multi-medium matte glue. And this sentiment is perfect for this card since it's elegant and it's large enough to fill up that white space in the middle part of the card. Once the sentiment is adhered, I'll go ahead and attach it to an A2 card base measuring at 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And I was able to create a bunch of cards using this technique since the coloring was pretty minimal. For the second card I'm making, I've gone ahead and heat embossed the same two flower images in white. I'm using distressings to quickly color up these flowers, and you'll see the white heat embossed areas since it will resist the ink. For the leaves, I'm using 3 colors of green, so it has a bit of shading happening. I'm also choosing a solid color cardstock for the background, and I'm deciding how to color up the flowers based on that background. Even when I tried to plan ahead though, I ended up changing my mind later. To color up the flowers, the red-orange color will be for the bottom portion of the flower, and for the top I'm using a golden yellow. So once I finish coloring up the flowers, I'll go ahead and trim them out, leaving a slight border. And if I had dyes, it'd be much easier, but I don't mind fussy cutting. As you can see, the flowers against that yellow wasn't enough of a contrast, but I tried it anyway. I also wanted to add texture to the background, so I embossed using a multi-sized dot folder. I'll also add a bit of Distress ink on top of the embossed areas to see if that helped with the card. But in the end, I decided that the orange helped the flowers pop out a lot more. I'm going to be using a sentiment from the Hero Arts Happy Stamp and Die set, cutting out the Happy sentiment. I'll go ahead and use the same distress inks I used for the leaves to do an ombre look on the Happy sentiment. I'll also take the Mother Day stamp from the same stamp set and stamp it on white cardstock, and I'll trim it down onto a strip. And using a MISTI just helps me stamp it perfectly, and then also I stamp it twice because it didn't seem dark enough. So in that sense, I always like to use my MISTIs just in case I want to restamp. So for that color cardstock, I want to trim it on the edges just a little bit so it'll leave a white border peeking out. And once I'm happy with it, I'll go ahead and adhere it directly to the cardstock. And for the rest of the items, I'll add score tape to the sentiment, and I'll use a Tombow Mono Multi Glue for the flowers and for the happy sentiment. And I put a very thin layer on it so that when I press it down, the glue won't seep out. And after I glue it directly to the card base, I'll put a acrylic block on top just so that it makes sure that it sticks, especially since I used an embossing folder for the texture of the cardstock. I want to make sure that everything won't fall apart afterwards. For the happy sentiment, once I finish adding on all the glue, I'll adhere to the cardstock, but I'll not press down on the letter Y. And I do this because I want to weave the sentiment strip through that Y just to incorporate it a little bit more. But once I'm happy with the sentiment strip and I make sure it's straight, I'll press it down. To finish off this card, I will trim off all the excess from the flowers and the sentiment strip. I also mass produced this card as well, so you can see the different card variety I have. Both these cards use the same stamp set and exactly the same flowers, but the techniques make them look completely different and in a good way. I really liked how both sets of cards turned out, and I hope you did too. Have a great day, and I'll see you next week for another video. Bye!